There was a chair at the end of the fourth row. Not a special chair, not a monument, not anything you would look at twice if you wandered into Grace Fellowship Church on an ordinary Sunday morning in Denton, Georgia. A folding metal chair with a thin blue cushion, worn at the centre, the way cushions wear when someone has sat in the same spot for years. The kind of chair that dozens of sanctuaries all across this country stack in storage rooms and drag out when the congregation outgrows the pews and needs extra seating along the walls. This particular chair sat against the south wall, end of the fourth row from the rear, where the late afternoon light came through the window in summer and painted a long, warm rectangle across the floor. It was there every Sunday. It would be arranged early in the morning before the rest of the congregation arrived, in exactly the same position, exactly the same angle, cushion straight. And no one sat in it, not because the cushion was worn through, not because the chair was broken or wobbly or in any way unfit for use, because Alma Jean Bridges had kept it that way, and in this congregation, that was sufficient. Alma Jean was 73 years old that November. She had run the Sunday service setup committee for 31 years, had arranged the flowers on the altar for more funerals than she could have counted if she tried, had organised the Wednesday night community supper every week since 1988, missing only a handful of times. Once for a hospitalisation of her own, twice for travel to her eldest daughter's home in North Carolina, once for a February ice storm that had closed every road in the county. She was the kind of woman who arrived before the pastor and left after the deacons, who remembered every congregant's food allergy without a list, who knew which hymn number corresponded to which particular Sunday's scripture reading, who could be found at 7:30 on a Sunday morning placing a fresh arrangement of carnations or dahlias or whatever the season allowed on the side table near the entrance, working without haste, without complaint, without requiring anyone to notice. The congregation loved her the way you love a load-bearing wall in an old house so completely, so permanently, that you stop registering it as something separate from the house itself, and the gratitude only announces itself in the moment you imagine its absence. The chair had been Harold's. Harold Bridges had sat in that spot every Sunday from the fall of 1987, when he and Alma Jean first joined this congregation, after moving to Denton for his work with the County Roads Department, until the spring of 1999 when he deployed with his National Guard unit to Kosovo. He had been a man of exact habits. The same seat, week after week, the same hymnal held loosely in his left hand, pages slightly bent from years of use, the same slight lean of his shoulder toward Alma Jean during the sermon, a lean so habitual and small that Alma Jean had not even noticed it consciously until it was gone. Whenever the pastor said something that amused him, something wry buried in a scripture reading or a piece of scriptural observation that most of the congregation took at face value, Harold would tap the back of Alma Jean's hand twice on the armrest between them, just twice, deliberate and quiet, and Alma Jean would not look at him, would keep her eyes forward, but would press her lips together to hold back the smile, and Harold would settle back satisfied. And that would be that. He was 51 years old when they called him up. Some people thought the Guard would not deploy a man his age. Harold did not argue about it in either direction. He went. Harold had not come home from Kosovo, not in the way they prayed for. He came home in June of 1999 in a ceremony at the county airstrip, a grey morning, a flag folded with 13 folds, and presented with both hands to his wife. Alma Jean received it with both hands and held it against her chest for a moment, and the young man who presented it could not quite meet her eyes, and she thanked him, because that was who she was. She didn't cry there at the airstrip. She cried later, sitting alone in the car in the parking lot of a gas station 3 miles away, and she allowed herself that for 11 minutes, and then she drove home. She had kept his chair, she made no ceremony of it. No announcement from the congregation, no official declaration, no sign or marker of any kind. She simply continued to arrive early each Sunday and arrange the sanctuary, and the folding chair at the end of the fourth row was always there, always open, seat cushion straight, and the congregation understood, without being instructed, that it was not available. Over the years, a few visitors had moved toward it, drawn by the open space, not knowing, and every time a member of the congregation would appear at the newcomer's elbow with a warm expression and a quiet word, and a gentle redirect toward another open seat. And the visitor would glance over at the chair and then at Alma Jean, and absorb something they would carry with them afterward, even if they could not have said exactly what it was. 26 years is a long time to keep a seat. When people asked Alma Jean about it, which they occasionally did, usually the newer members who hadn't been around long enough to know not to ask, she would look at them with her steady brown eyes and say, quietly, that she didn't know when Harold might come back in some form. Through a face she recognised, through a voice that caught her off guard on a Tuesday afternoon, she said the chair was for whatever piece of him might still wander in one morning and need a place to rest, and she said it without drama or performance, the way a person states a thing they have simply decided is true and have ceased to argue about. Nobody in the congregation thought she was unravelling. Nobody worried over her mental state or took aside her daughters and whispered. They had watched Alma Jean for 26 years, had watched her carry every flower arrangement and every pot of collard greens and every card signed for every sick congregant, and they knew that she was the most grounded and functional person in the room on any given Sunday. They thought she had simply decided that some promises had no expiration date, and that keeping Harold's chair was the private, daily version of the faith she expressed in every visible public thing she did. Nobody argued, now. What none of them knew, what no one in Denton had any reason to know, was that on a cold Tuesday morning in November of 2025, a man named Raymond Cole would step off a Greyhound bus at the Denton station with a canvas duffel bag and a transfer ticket for a noon departure toward Macon, and that Raymond had known Harold, not casually, not in passing, in the specific way that men know each other when they are young and afraid and far from home and dependent on each other in a way that civilian life almost never replicates. Raymond had been 22 years old in 1991 during the Gulf War. Harold had been his sergeant, 43 years old then, calm in the way of a man who had made his peace with serious things and no longer needed to perform that peace for anyone. Raymond had gotten separated from his unit during a stretch of days that he did not like to revisit in any detail, a confusing, miserable stretch during which he had made some decisions that he was not proud of and wound up isolated in a way that was genuinely dangerous. Harold had found him, had gone looking when he didn't have to, and had found him and had brought him back, and afterward, when Raymond was sitting in the particular kind of shaking silence that follows a bad few days, Harold had sat with him. Not talked, not lectured or debriefed or processed anything in a clinical way, just sat, present, for 2 hours. As if Raymond's need for company were the most natural thing, and Harold's presence were the most natural response, because Harold was the kind of man to whom those things were in fact natural. Raymond had thought about Harold for 34 years after that. Not every day, not obsessively, but with a regularity and a specificity that told him the debt was real and had not been discharged. He had tried to find him after separating from the army in 1994. He had located a forwarding address in Georgia through a mutual contact, a woman who had served in the same unit and kept better track of people than Raymond did. And he had written a letter. A decent letter. 3 pages, not flowery but genuine, that said the things he had wanted to say in person about what Harold sitting with him had meant. He said in the letter that he had been at a place where he was not sure he deserved to come back, and that Harold's presence, his plain and unremarked and completely uncomplicated presence, had been the thing that turned him around. He said he wanted Harold to know that. He said he thought about it on the 1st of each month, approximately. The way he thought about other things that had shaped the contour of his life. He had never heard back. He had concluded eventually that the letter had gone to the wrong address or been lost somewhere in the mail system, and he had let it go the way you let things go when life demands everything you have, and there is nothing left over for pursuing the things you cannot change. Life had demanded a great deal of Raymond in the years after. He had been married for 11 years to a woman named Loretta, who died of a sudden cardiac event in 2009, which was the worst thing that had happened to him in a life that had not been short of difficulty. He had 2 adult children, a son in Phoenix and a daughter in Baltimore, with whom his relationships were warm but infrequent in the way of adult children who have built their own dense lives. He had worked in facilities maintenance for the Linden City School District in Ohio for 18 years, which was good, quiet work that left him tired in the right way at the end of the day. He had retired in 2023 when his knees insisted, and the 3 years since had been the hardest in a way he found difficult to describe, because they were not hard due to any external crisis, but due to the specific interior difficulty of a person who has organized his life around usefulness and then found himself with nothing particular to be useful for. He was on his way to his cousin Gerald in Macon, who had a house with a spare room and had told Raymond on the phone that he was welcome for as long as he needed. Gerald was 2 years older than Raymond and had been retired from the Macon Water Department for 7 years and fished on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the offer was genuine, not a polite thing said and not meant. Raymond had waited 3 months to take him up on it because accepting help was not something he did with ease. He had spent his entire life being the one who showed up for other people, who fixed the gutters and organised the paperwork and drove the neighbour to the appointment, and the reversal of that arrangement sat in him uncomfortably, the way an old piece of clothing that no longer fits sits in a drawer, too familiar to discard, too wrong to wear. He wasn't sure of much that November morning. He had $340 in his wallet and a bus ticket and a canvas bag with 4 changes of clothes and his discharge papers and Loretta's photograph. The transfer in Denton was 2 hours and 40 minutes. Raymond left the bus station and walked up the main street because sitting still in a plastic chair felt wrong. He walked past the hardware store with its hand-lettered window signs, past the closed diner that had a handwritten note on the door saying back in January, past the dry cleaner, past a barber shop where an older man in a barber's smock was visible through the window reading a newspaper. He had no destination. He walked until he was cold enough to want to be inside somewhere, and what he found a block and a half off the main street was Grace Fellowship Church, its double doors propped open with 2 rubber wedge stops, warm air drifting out into the November chill. He went in because he was cold and because the open doors suggested he would not be questioned about being there. That was the full reason. He had not attended church with any regularity since Loretta died, not for lack of faith exactly, but for the specific difficulty of sitting in a congregation as a widow when the congregation was full of people who remembered you as half of something. He had not figured out how to be in that space alone, and he had simply stopped going rather than solve the problem. He pushed through the open doors and into the vestibule, and then into the sanctuary, and the warmth settled over him, and the smell of it, candle wax and wood polish, and the faint residual sweetness of Sunday flowers was familiar in a deep and bodily way. He heard someone moving near the back of the room. He turned and saw a woman, trim and upright and clearly at home in the space, arranging a vase of white carnations on a side table near the windows. She was wearing a dark cardigan over a printed blouse, natural grey hair close cropped, and she had the manner of someone doing a familiar task in a familiar place with no particular hurry. She looked up when she heard him and said good morning, in a voice that was warm and direct, and entirely unsurprised by a stranger in her sanctuary. He said good morning back and stood near the entrance and explained himself briefly. He had a bus at noon. He was cold. He meant no trouble and just wanted to sit somewhere warm for a bit. She said, "Of course, sit anywhere you like." He thanked her. Raymond walked down the centre aisle slowly, looking at the pews and the folding chairs arranged along the south wall, and he was looking for a seat that would give him a clear sightline to the door without requiring him to sit directly in someone's way, which was an old habit he did not think about consciously. He moved toward the 4th row from the rear because it had open space and good light. He stopped. The chair at the end of that row stopped him. He stood and looked at it the way you look at something that triggers a memory so precisely specific that you cannot immediately locate the source. The chair was nothing, just a folding chair with a thin cushion. He could not have said what made him stop. Something about the quality of the empty space, the angle of light crossing the cushion from the south window, the particular settled look of a chair that had been placed there deliberately, as if someone expected it to be occupied. It hit him with an indistinct recognition that he could not name or explain. He did not sit in the end chair. He sat in the chair immediately beside it and set his canvas bag on the floor and looked out at the sanctuary, and the morning light came through the high windows and the room was warm and quiet. Alma Jean had watched him from across the sanctuary. She had watched him come down the aisle and stop, had watched the slight shift in his posture when he saw that particular chair, had watched him choose the seat beside it rather than the chair itself. She was not a woman who invented things about what she observed. She had spent enough years reading a room to know when something was worth noting, and when she was reaching. She noted it. She could not have said why it mattered, only that it did, the same way she had always known without argument or analysis that the chair was worth keeping. She walked over with her hands clasped in front of her and asked if the seat was comfortable. He said it was fine, and thanked her again, and she introduced herself and asked, in the ordinary way of someone with a congregation to look after, where he was coming from and where he was headed. He told her, Columbus, Ohio, down toward Macon, passing through on a transfer. She asked if he had family down this way. He said a cousin. A pause, then he said he was a veteran, said it simply as a way of accounting for himself that felt honest without being a burden to anyone. She said, "My husband was a veteran." She said it with the same simplicity, the two statements belonging together, a sentence and its matching sentence. He looked at her then, not casually. He asked what branch, what years. She said, Army National Guard. The Gulf, she said, in 91. And then later, in 99, Kosovo. She felt the pause before she saw it register on his face. A beat, a fraction of silence that was different from ordinary silence. He asked her in a voice that had gone careful what her husband's name was. Alma Jean said, Harold. Harold. The silence after that was not ordinary silence. It filled the room from floor to ceiling. Alma Jean felt it in the center of her chest, a pressure that was not pain exactly, but was in the vicinity of pain, in the same neighborhood, the body's way of registering that something consequential is happening before the mind has fully processed what. Raymond's hands, which had been resting open on his knees, tightened. His jaw set once, briefly. His eyes went bright in a way that was not happiness, not quite, but something that lives in the same country as happiness, and cannot be reached except through grief first. He breathed, long and slow through his nose. He said, I knew Harold Bridges. He said the name with a care that Alma Jean recognized because it was the care she used when she said it herself. She sat down. Her legs required it. She sat in the chair between him and the end of the row, not in Harold's chair, and turned toward Raymond. She said, Tell me. He told her. He was a man of the generation that doesn't elaborate what does not need elaborating, and so he was not brief, but he was not excessive either. He told her about 1991, about being 22 years old and knew enough to service that he was still making decisions based on pride when he should have been making them based on sense. He told her about the stretch of days he did not name specifically, and she did not ask him to, and he told her what Harold had done and how it had felt to have someone come looking when Raymond had not yet decided he deserved to be found. He told her about sitting afterward and Harold's silence and how Harold had, without a word of instruction or correction, communicated to him that he was still worth sitting beside. He told her he had tried to write after he got out. He described the letter, the address he had used, his uncertainty about whether it had ever arrived. He said he had carried the unpaid debt for 34 years. He said that was not meant to be a dramatic statement, just a true one. Alma Jean listened with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on his face, and when he finished she did not speak immediately. The light from the south window moved a fraction across the floor between them. She put her hand on top of his, on his knee. She said, He would have wanted you to know that he was glad he found you. She said it without hesitation, with the authority of a woman who had been married to Harold for 17 years and knew how he thought about things. Raymond could not speak. He nodded once, and then he pressed the back of his free hand against his mouth briefly, and then he simply sat. He did not weep. He was too old and too seasoned in the management of large feeling for weeping, or perhaps it was just that the feeling was too large for weeping, which is a different thing. He held it the way you hold something that has been too long without a place to be set down. They sat together in that sanctuary for an hour and 20 minutes. Alma Jean told him about Harold, not about Kosovo, not about the ceremony at the airstrip, not about any of the things people usually wanted to know about in the way of tragedy. She told him about Harold alive, about the way he made Sunday morning eggs, badly, insistently, without variation or improvement for 12 years, scrambled and slightly dry on the outside and slightly wet on the inside, and how she'd stopped trying to correct his technique somewhere around 1994 because he was so pleased with himself each time he produced them. About the tap-tap on the armrest, about the way Harold talked to strangers in gas stations and grocery stores, not performatively, but genuinely, as if each stranger was simply a neighbour he hadn't been introduced to yet. About the pecan tree Harold had planted in the backyard in 1989, which was now enormous and still giving. About the way Harold wrote down his thoughts in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. Not for any official purpose, just because he believed in keeping track of what mattered. She told Raymond about Harold the way you tell the living to the living, with affection and specificity, and the implicit understanding that the telling is itself a kind of keeping. Raymond listened with complete attention. He asked a question here and there, small questions, clarifying questions, the questions of a man who is hearing something he wants to hold accurately. When she told him about the tap-tap on the armrest, he smiled, briefly, and she could see in that smile that he recognized something, a quality of Harold that matched something he already carried. Clara Weston, one of the associate ministers, came through the side door at some point during this conversation, holding her keys and her appointment calendar, and she stopped when she saw Alma Jean sitting with the stranger. She looked at Alma Jean's face. Clara had known Alma Jean for 20 years and knew that face in its ordinary arrangements, and she saw now that this was not an ordinary arrangement. She did not ask. She went quietly to the small kitchen at the back of the annex and put a pot of coffee on, and found the good cups, the ones kept for visiting clergy, and brought 2 cups out and set them on the edge of the pew near the 2 of them, and went back to her morning without a word. Alma Jean and Raymond both said, "Thank you," without looking up, and Clara heard that and went back to her work with a particular feeling in her chest that she would try to describe to her husband, Devon, that evening, and she would say that it was like watching something that had been lost for a very long time finally get where it was going. And Devon would say he thought he understood, and she would think he probably did. Kindness keeps a long memory. That was the truth Alma Jean had built her life around without ever using those exact words. 26 years of a kept chair was the long, quiet form of that truth. She had not kept it in expectation of any particular return. She had not kept it as a transaction or a prayer with a specific object. She had kept it because Harold had believed in open doors, in maintained welcomes, in the small, faithful act of simply leaving room, and the chair was her daily practice of the thing Harold had lived by. She had not imagined that the practice had an appointment. She had not, in 26 years, articulated any specific expectation of what the chair might draw in. She had kept it the way you keep a habit that feels true, not because you can justify it to anyone who asks, but because stopping it would feel like a small self-betrayal, a closing off of something that you have decided should stay open. If someone had pressed her, she would have said only that Harold had been a man who believed in kept commitments and open doors, and that the chair was both at once, and that was as far as the explaining needed to go. Around 11:15, Raymond looked at his phone. He said his bus was at noon. He said it the way a man says something that he is not yet sure whether he wants to be true. Alma Jean looked at him. She said, "There's no good reason you have to be in Macon today, if today is not a specific requirement." He looked back at her. She said that the church kept a hospitality room in the annex, used for visiting pastors and the occasional missionary passing through on circuit work, and that the room was empty this week and had a proper bed and a private bath and its own entrance from the parking lot, and he was welcome to stay a day or 2 if he needed to rest before continuing. He started to refuse. She could see it in the assembly of his posture. Then he stopped himself, mid-assembly, and looked at her with those careful eyes that had been registering everything in the room since the moment he walked in. He said, "I wouldn't want to put anyone out." She said, "The room is made up. The heat is already on. The only one who will be put out is the dust." He said yes. He said it in a quiet, unelaborate way, without further negotiation. The sound of a man who has allowed himself, after a considerable interval, to accept something. That night was the Wednesday evening supper which Alma Jean had organised every week for 37 years. 37 folding tables draped in plastic, 37 trips to the kitchen to check on the cornbread and the greens and the chicken, 37 evenings of watching the congregation fill up and spill over and be fed and depart and leave the hall quieter and warmer at the same time. She organised this one as she always did, and Raymond came from the annex and sat at one of the long tables and was introduced the way Alma Jean introduced people she had received into the church's care, by first name and city of origin, and nothing more that wasn't his to share. Deacon Marcus Webb was 80 years old, a Vietnam veteran who wore his service cap to every occasion, including supper, and had earned the right to wear it wherever he pleased without commentary. He sat across from Raymond, and the 2 of them fell into conversation within the first few minutes, the way veterans of a certain age fall into conversation, without preamble or performance, at the level of things they both already knew. Marcus's wife, Ruth, 77, refilled their coffee cups 4 times over the course of the evening without being asked or acknowledged, and each time she did, she looked at the two of them talking and felt something she did not analyze. Alma-Jun moved between the kitchen and the tables that evening the way she always moved, attending to what needed attending, but she found herself stopping more than usual near the corner of the room where Raymond and Marcus sat. She was not eavesdropping. She simply stood there for a moment, here and there, and felt the conversation between those two men the way you feel weather before it arrives, as a pressure change, as a quality in the air. Marcus was a man who did not give his attention easily and who held it back from most people as a matter of constitutional preference, and he had given it to Raymond completely. Leaned forward over his coffee cup, speaking in a low, concentrated register that Alma-Jun had heard him use with very few people over the 22 years she had known him. Ruth Webb, setting a basket of cornbread on their end of the table, caught Alma-Jun's eye and said nothing, which was the most she needed to say. Alma-Jun watched from across the room and felt the word that had visited her in the car that afternoon. Quiet. Not the quiet of an empty house, or the quiet of loss, both of which she knew intimately. The other kind. The quiet that arrives when something long in transit has finally arrived where it was going, and the arrival is unremarkable in its outward form, and enormous in its actual weight. Raymond stayed 3 days. On the second morning, he came out of the annex room at 7 and found Marcus standing at the side of the building looking up at a gutter that had been pulling away from the fascia for several weeks. Raymond asked if he could help. Marcus said he'd been meaning to get to it. Raymond said he was handy, and he was. They spent 2 hours on a ladder and on the ground, Raymond doing the climbing because his knees, though bad, were better than Marcus's, and by 10 in the morning the gutter was sealed and resecured, and Marcus declared the results satisfactory, which for Marcus Webb constituted a standing ovation. On the third morning, Raymond attended the Thursday prayer service, which was small and informal, 18 or 20 people in a circle of chairs near the front of the sanctuary. He sat in the fourth row from the rear as he had the morning he arrived, and he chose the same seat he had chosen then, not the end chair, the one beside it, and Alma-Jun noticed this from across the circle and said nothing about it, and the noticing sat in her chest, warm and uncomplicated. On the morning of the fourth day, she drove him to the bus station. She made him a bag lunch, 2 sandwiches and an apple, and a bag of the oatmeal cookies she made for the Wednesday suppers, and wrapped it in a paper bag and put his name on it in marker, not because he might forget whose it was, but because she wanted his name on something she had made. He accepted it without excess, put it in his canvas bag, thanked her. At the bus station, she pulled to the curb, and they sat in the running car for a moment. He said he was going to write her a proper letter once he was settled. He said it the way people say things they intend to do. She said she knew he would. He said her name, Mrs. Bridges. The same care in it as when he said Harold's name. She said he chose good ones, the ones he looked after. He always chose good ones. She said it looking straight through the windshield, not at Raymond, but in the direction of something that wasn't in the parking lot. Raymond got out. He lifted his canvas bag from the back seat and stood on the sidewalk and looked at her through the window for a moment. Then he nodded. One nod, deliberate, the specific nod that carries everything a man has decided not to say because the saying is already fully accomplished by the nod. She drove home. She parked in the driveway of the house she had shared with Harold for 12 years before he deployed and sat for a few minutes in the car. The pecan tree was bare, November, but it was still there, enormous and deeply rooted, and she could see the high branches from the driveway, still and dark against the grey sky. She was not sad. She wanted to be precise about that, at least to herself. She was the opposite of sad, which does not have a name as clean and direct as sad, so she held the feeling and let it be what it was without naming it. She had kept a chair open for 26 years, and it had mattered. Not supernaturally. Not in the way of apparitions or visions, or it had mattered in the true way, the way that faithfulness to a practice creates the conditions for things that would not otherwise be possible. The chair was an open door. The open door was a form of saying that something is welcome here, and Raymond had walked through a propped open church door on a cold Tuesday morning, looking for nowhere in particular to be warm, and he had found a door that had been open longer than he had known. Harold would have understood that immediately. She went inside. She made tea. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the dormant garden and the pecan tree, and let the quiet of the house settle around her. Then she walked to the front room where Harold's photograph sat on the small table, the one from 1991. Harold in uniform, looking slightly to the left of the camera, because he was always watching the room. She said, one of yours came back. She said it the way she said things to Harold's photograph, without self-consciousness, without drama, as a simple transmission between one kind of presence and another. Raymond's letter arrived 6 weeks later, 3 pages in a careful, steady hand. He wrote that he was settled with Gerald and that it was going better than expected, that there was a small VA satellite office 20 minutes away that was helping him sort out some paperwork that had been tangled for years and that might, once sorted, change his monthly situation in a meaningful way. He wrote that he had been sleeping better. He did not explain this specifically, but Alma Jean understood it. He said he hoped she was well. He said, "Please give his regards to the congregation, to Deacon Webb, to the woman who made the coffee without being asked." He said he had not told many people what happened in Denton, not because it was a secret, but because he had not yet found the words that were equal to it. He signed it, with gratitude, Raymond Cole, U.S. Army, retired. Alma Jean folded the letter along its original folds and carried it to the front room and set it on the table beside Harold's photograph. She sat down in the armchair across from it and looked at Harold's face, the slight lean to the left, the quality of attention in his eyes. The following Sunday, the sanctuary at Grace Fellowship was fuller than usual. Word had moved through the congregation in the quiet, thorough way that word moves through a community that has shared something and wants to be near each other without necessarily being able to explain why. People came who usually came, and a few came who had been away for a while, and a few came for the first time, and Alma Jean greeted all of them at the door because that was her place on Sunday mornings. She arrived early, as she always did. She arranged the chairs. She set out the flowers. She turned the furnace up 2 degrees because November was still cold, and the chair at the end of the 4th row sat open, as it always had, as it would continue to do. There are people who will hear this story and want it to be larger than it is, a formal ceremony, a plaque, some official recognition with a podium and a microphone and a check written in public that would make it feel complete in the way official things are designed to feel complete. Those people are not wrong to want that. They just wouldn't quite be seeing the story. The completeness was already there, had been there for 26 years in the faithful, unremarkable daily act of a woman who decided that some things were worth maintaining even without an audience, even without the guarantee of a return. The completeness was in the coffee brought without being asked, and the letter written in a careful hand, and the nod from a bus station sidewalk, and the 3 days in a room with a proper bed. It was in the bag lunch with his name written on it. It was in Harold, 43 years old, going looking in the desert for a 22-year-old who had not yet decided he deserved to be found. It was in the 2 hours Harold had sat without requiring anything of the silence or of Raymond, just present, patient, steady in the way of a man who understands that presence is sometimes the only thing that reaches someone. It was in a woman who loved that man well enough to keep practicing the principle he had lived by, year after year, quietly, without anyone required to notice or applaud. It was in the chair, kept open, in the name, said with care, in a seat that had been waiting since 1999 for whoever might still need it, not because the woman who kept it had been certain anyone would come, but because she had decided that open doors were worth maintaining regardless, that faithfulness to a thing matters even without a guaranteed return, that kindness, given and kept and practiced, has a longer memory than we do. That is the whole of it. That is everything, and it is enough.